You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is here with me, and we are here to discuss all the news related to the streaming services from December 3rd through December 9th. We have a couple different news topics to discuss. We also have a couple of different discussions, if time permits, to get to some of them. But the first thing I want to bring up is actually something that happened prior to Thanksgiving, but for whatever reason, in the last episode, I forgot to mention it. But I think it's something that deserves some attention. It was made known that there's a theater. It's called the Paris Theater, and this is something that is actually in New York City, and it was going to be going out of business. This is a theater that only has one single screen, and Netflix actually stepped in and decided that they were going to basically come to a arrangement to have the lease for the theater. This way, it benefits them in the sense of, besides the fact that it gets them some really good PR for a company that doesn't typically deal with theaters, it also allows them to have a venue within New York City that they can actually screen a lot of their films that they're looking to submit for awards and things like that. So I just wanted to quickly bring that up because I thought that was kind of an interesting little thing that popped up, because I don't think anybody would have guessed, if you looked back a year ago, I don't think anybody would have guessed, yes, Netflix is they're gonna go in on a deal to basically be part owners on a theater. So don't think anybody saw that. But then diving into some of the other news, first things first, Comcast has actually announced that they are planning on doing their own investor presentation. This is actually going to take place in January. On January 16th, they're going to present the Peacock service to investors at their New York headquarters at Rockefeller Plaza, and they are going to discuss kind of what their intent for the service will be. Obviously, we've heard a number of different rumors as far and wide as it could be a all-free service. It could be something in the lines of CBS All Access. And then for a short amount of time, although I haven't heard any talk about this recently, there was an idea that it could potentially be something like Disney Plus or HBO Max, but specifically NBC Universal properties. However, that idea is long gone. That is not happening if for no other reason other than we haven't heard anything about that kind of model anytime recently. If anything, they're going for the CBS All Access model, in the sense of kind of a little bit of content, not a massive amount of content, that the original content that is, but also at the same time have the ability to supply a lot of back catalog like CBS All Access. They will also focus a little bit on sports as well, because they do have the Olympics locked down come the summer. They have the streaming rights locked down for the Olympics for the foreseeable future. So that means you'll be able to have Peacock and actually watch a lot of the Olympic coverage that you would otherwise, you'd have to be flipping back and forth between a lot of the different channels to see. But instead, you might be able to watch all of the coverage that they have on television actually on Peacock, which is expected because that is something that's been rumored and talked about since the very beginning of Peacock being announced. So expect a big announcement for Peacock on January 16th. The other question, of course, is that originally this was set to debut sometime in April. There was talk about potentially early March. The fact that they're doing an investor presentation on January 16th, I guess that begs the question of when can we predict the service to actually launch at this point in time? And I would say, I think they're still going to be aiming to get it out before HBO Max. Not that it's going to be necessarily direct competition to HBO Max, other than it just being another streaming service. But I think that their plan is to try to get this out by the end of April at the very latest. So that's my prediction at this point in time. But expect a lot more Peacock details very soon, and expect Tony to be saying the word Peacock more than he'd like to.
Yeah. Well, I'm good for Comcast and getting this started. Evidently, they're getting a $2 billion investment in their first 2 years, and the CFO says that they're going to aim to turn a profit in year 5. That's pretty ambitious goals, given what we know about some of these other streaming services. But it seems that most of this $2 billion investment is going to go into like content spending, which makes sense. Looks like Comcast is finally, they announced Peacock and they've like leaked out details, but it's nice to see them actually like going in and seeing the, the business side of what Comcast is expecting of Peacock and seeing more of that side.
All right. So then next up, there is a service. I don't think we've ever discussed it, but I'm going to just give a refresher course for those of you who are unaware. There's a service called Plex. And if you are unfamiliar with Plex, it's basically an OTT service where you can subscribe. It's available on a variety of different devices.
What is OTT?
Over the top service. It's basically like anything that isn't just a cable channel type thing. It's something you have to download because it is a service that is outside the realm of a cable provider or something like that. So you have to download an app and either subscribe. In Plex, however, it's a free service. There is a premium option, but it is a free service that offers content available to watch with ads spruced within the content, so that way you can still watch things on demand, but you just will need to watch the stuff with commercials. So it's the idea of watching something on television, but you get to watch it on demand whenever you want. There are already a variety of other companies that do this. There's some interesting things with Plex. So one thing is they just launched their ad-supported service in over 200 countries. This was just last week that they did this. The other part of this is that they actually have a number of titles licensed from Lionsgate, MGM, Legendary, including Warner Brothers as well. They have a ton of content that they actually have licensed that they will have on their service. They have available for people to watch at any given time. Now, yes, things will come on and off just like any other service that you're watching. They say that on average, if you watch 1 hour's worth of content, you'll be watching between 5 to 7 minutes of ads. And technically, that is a lot. That's about half as much, or even a third as much advertisements as if you were watching something on a cable channel or a broadcast channel per hour. So it is still ads, obviously, but it's significantly less ads than you would get anywhere else. An ad-supported streaming service is something that is very interesting because we've talked about how HBO Max is looking for ad-supported version, while Amazon, Netflix, and Disney Plus, as well as Apple TV Plus, haven't discussed any ad-supported version whatsoever. We know that CBS All Access supports an ad-supported version. Peacock is likely to have an ad-supported version, and HBO Max is probably the biggest one of the ad-supported services that, even though it won't launch with an ad-supported version immediately in 2020, that is part of phase 2 within 2020 by 2021. So these ad-supported things are getting big. There's already a number of other services out there. One of the ones that I've heard about recently is Tubi. And the reason why is because they started an ad campaign that's called Not on Netflix, where they showcase content that isn't on Netflix and is free to, the service is free. Plex is something that is interesting. One of the big backers behind Plex, because a lot of these companies have some sort of media company backing them. When I looked up Plex TV to get a little understanding of who the people are behind it, the one company that kind of stuck out between the 9 that they list as their top investors is Tribune Media. And if you're unaware of who Tribune Media is, Tribune Media runs a variety of different cable stations across the country, including WGN America. They're also a pretty big Chicago station with WGN, the radio station, and WGN, the television station as well. They also run CLTV. It's a very primarily focused in Chicago, but WGN as a network is across the country on cable stations. But Tribune Media is pretty big, so that's the main company that seems to be behind them, at least the ones that have a hand already in the media end of things. So that's what Plex is. But if you were so inclined and you're looking for a service that offers content but you don't have to pay for it, Plex might be an option for you.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, my experience with Plex was more the software side, where you can load your movie library and you can stream it to your TV. It was one of the first easy ways to stream your movie collection from your computer to the television. So it's nice to see how they're branching out and going to bigger and better things. I didn't know about Tribune Media. That's very interesting to know.
Yes. So another thing that also happened in the last 2 weeks is that there was a conference in Europe, and a lot of the streaming services were in attendance, including Amazon, Netflix, and HBO Max. And while they were there, they actually talked about a lot of their international plans for the immediate future. Now, they're going to vary from company to company, but one of the things that actually was on our list of stuff to bring up at some point in the near future was HBO Max's international plans. We've talked about HBO Max at length a number of times, but one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that I keep seeing news reports. The last one that I saw was actually back in November, on November 21st. There was a company called Stars Play. They have landed the UK rights to DC Universe's Doom Patrol, which, as we know, the second season of Doom Patrol is actually coming to HBO Max here in the States, as well as DC Universe. So the question, of course, becomes, if HBO Max keeps licensing out their content to these other providers in Europe, what content will they have for their service when they eventually move to an international rollout? They obviously are focusing very greatly on the Latin America market because that's going to be their first aspect of doing any sort of international rollout. But I've kept thinking about this and thinking, I keep seeing these news reports over and over again about how these top tier shows that we're seeing either on HBO specifically or have been announced for HBO Max, how they're being licensed to other ones. There was a couple just last month that were announced that Sky is going to have a number of the rights to some of the HBO Max shows come launch time. When they air here in the United States, they'll air on Sky over in Europe, and I thought that was odd. There's also been a number of big deals that have been made. There was also one recently with some of the content on HBO Max going to Canada via Bell, and I just have to wonder, what would be the reason behind this? Well, as it turns out, we didn't get a lot of answers. I'll just give you the spoiler warning here. There wasn't a lot of answers here, but my understanding of it, based off of some different articles that I've read and things like that, is while HBO Max intends on doing an international rollout, it's going to be a very slow international rollout, meaning we might not actually see a large international rollout within the first 3 years that the service actually is from the time the service actually launches. Their focus for 2021 is probably going to be the Latin America market, and they might not actually get into Europe until year 3 at the very earliest. And part of the reason is, if you remember correctly from the investor conference, they specifically were asked, how are you going to have this service available in other countries, or something to that regard. And one of the comments that was made was, well, when we roll out to other countries, we're not necessarily going to be charging $15 for the service. We're going to be changing the price of the service based off of, the median income range of that country, which means technically certain countries, if their median income is much less than here in the United States where we're based, that means that those services, that same service, could be reduced in cost in those countries. However, that also means that there could be content that they feel is worth more money to actually license to another channel, meaning that you're not going to necessarily get the massive amount of content that the people here in the United States are getting for the $15 a month. When it eventually launches in Europe, could you see something in the range of like $7 or $8 a month, and half as much of the content is what we currently have? Maybe a lot of the back library of what HBO has, and a lot of the back library and catalog that Warner Media offers. But the newer original content is much more sparse because a lot of that stuff has been licensed out to other channels. Yes, certainly it could, but a lot of that could stem from the fact that they're just looking for lower price points in different countries because they don't believe $15 everywhere in the world is an actual feasible number. So I wanted to just quickly touch on that. And did you have any thoughts about what they could potentially do with their international rollout? What you think they might do?
I guess I don't have anything new that I haven't said before. Just I think HBO is looking at this a little bit differently than some other players. Remember a while back we talked about the earnings reports for Q3. and we talked about Netflix's report and how they were detailing their big push for international, rollout, even more than they are right now. And they were talking about a bunch of different things, but one of the costs that we haven't really talked about is infrastructure costs, where what I mean by infrastructure, not necessarily like licensing and all that stuff, although one could potentially categorize that, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is like the technical infrastructure. And, there was like a few episodes back, I went on a very kind of boring, but I thought very in-depth view of how streaming videos actually work. And I talked about CDNs. So essentially, for those who don't really remember that conversation, these companies use CDNs. What a CDN really means is instead of having the video hosted somewhere far away from you, right? These companies can essentially put the video closer to you. So it's kind of like Amazon in the sense of instead of shipping it from like the main place, they could ship it from a warehouse that's closer to you. That's kind of how you should view this. But creating this infrastructure is costly. You're creating it at scale. Now, Netflix has had a long time to do this and figured out the bugs and whatnot. And we've kind of seen some struggles from like Disney Plus to try to like grow, and we see those growing pains. But I think HBO Max, given the fact of like, they haven't really rolled out in America quite yet. And even though they had success with like HBO proper, but HBO Max is going to be a different beast. They're for the short term doing this international rollout, but instead of, them building this infrastructure, they're using other people's infrastructure. They're licensing out that content. And that's a different business strategy, but I don't think it's bad because AT&T and Warner Media and the whole entire structure of companies, they're looking at HBO Max as a really huge investment to really drive growth, to make up revenue for like DirecTV and their other media services. And so they don't want to lose a bunch of money into this venture. And so they're going to try to make it as profitable as fast as they can. And so if they could save costs by licensing out this content and then eventually growing the infrastructure, but they don't have to do that at the moment, I think that's pretty smart, especially, for overseas where servers and places and stuff like that could maybe not necessarily be expensive, but hard to deal with just because you're, international. And that's kind of how I see HBO is going, just a different route, but I think it's smart for HBO. It takes off some of the risk for HBO to deliver because they're trusting all these other partners to deliver who they're pretty trustworthy partners. So like they're going to deliver. So it takes some of the risk off, like, Warner Brothers, Warner Media, and AT&T, and places it onto these other partners that are going to be distributing the content. And that's kind of how I view this, which I kind of said this for a long time. It's just a different game, and I think it's smart for a company that's trying to take on less risk.
Yeah, I think, and that is something that we've talked about a lot. I mean, I brought it up multiple times about how the entire basis behind Warner Media prior to them being owned by AT&T and prior to the idea of HBO Max has always been about licensing their content elsewhere. That has been a lot of what their core business is and a lot of where they get a lot of their money from. And they're not going to necessarily give up on that right away because I have been critical about the idea of if they're going to do this stuff internationally eventually, why would they do this? Why would they license out their top tier content that is going to be available on the service? And I've been very critical of the idea of why would you do this? You're just making your own service not have as much value. But I can honestly see the perspective of where they're coming from. I want them to go all in, obviously, because I want them to show that they are all in on this idea. But to go all in would be too much of a shift in basically their revenue stream. They have to show that HBO Max by itself can work to the investors. If they go all in on HBO Max, especially before they even launch, and don't have the ability to have a backup plan with the content licensed elsewhere, and HBO Max doesn't gain as many subscribers as they anticipate within the first couple of years, then maybe they need to scale back and say, well, maybe we don't go internationally for now. Maybe we hold off on that and we just continue these licensing agreements with other companies because that is a steady source of revenue, and we haven't really met our subscriber growth that we really wanted with here in the States, so we can't guarantee that that's going to happen elsewhere. So for that reason, I can see why they would do it. Well, I would love for them to be like, we're all in, kind of how Disney has done with Disney Plus and the intent of what they are planning on doing with ESPN Plus and Hulu. The reality of it is Warner Media is honestly a much larger company in the sense of the amount of content that they create that Disney isn't. Disney is a larger company in the sense of other things that they do. and they're worth more money, but Warner Media produces a massive amount more content than Disney, even with 20th Century Fox, does. So I think it's important for Warner Brothers not to necessarily cut the umbilical cord of what they currently have right now and stick with the easy revenue that they have while they test a lot of these new things, because honestly it would be really not it would not be an ideal situation for them, especially in the situation that they've been in the last couple of years with the investors, if they were to go the route of going all in the same way Disney Plus did, only for it to not pan out the way they want it to, and then they basically have cut off the relationships they've had with a lot of these other companies who are very happy to pay money to license these other shows. That part of it I completely understand. The other part of the international conference was Amazon and Netflix also talking about what their plans are for basically focusing on different international markets. And Netflix basically stated that they're looking to rev up plans to create a lot more non-English language originals. We've seen success with different Netflix originals like Dark and Rain, which have been non-English speaking shows that have been dubbed, or in some cases other shows have had subtitles. And those shows, they've gotten success. And one of the things that they specifically said is that they're looking at trying to come up with which international market and which show they could do their next original interactive thing, kind of like how they did with Black Mirror Bandersnatch. They're looking at which one can they do that with when it comes to an international project. They also stated that they realized that the number of people who are actually viewing international projects has gone up from 30% a couple years back to now over 50% of the subscribers are viewing other content that are from international markets. So it shows that there is a desire for this content from the international markets. So ultimately, while Netflix is specifically focusing on a specific international market, it still has global appeal, to a degree, and that's why they can do these things, because despite a show being successful in that small international market, it can still garner attention elsewhere and become something big. Speaking of which, Money Heist just announced that part 4 of the series is actually coming in the next couple months. So there's, and that was a Spanish international a Spanish project that, was dubbed into English and has become extremely popular here in the United States, despite it not being an English or a United States project. So then the last company was Amazon. Their take on basically the international market was that they said that they're specifically not looking at a volume game. Instead, they're looking at creating a select number of hyper-local shows, specifically meaning they're looking at creating shows that are designed specifically for a certain market and focusing very heavily on those markets. Similar to the way that's kind of similar how Netflix started in the beginning. One of the first major international projects that Netflix had that garnered more attention elsewhere was The Crown, and while the U.S. it's not new to the U.S. to have British content, it was probably one of the first projects that Netflix did that was focusing on an international market and kind of testing the waters. And what I'm guessing basically from these things that Amazon said is that they're going to be taking a very similar approach, creating specific content for certain markets with the hope that it can also get that global focus as well as they slowly build up their amount of content that they have as well for the international market. All right, the last bit of news is there was an interesting thing that came out from Variety. There was an interview that was done at Variety with the head of Netflix Original Films, and he specifically said, Scott Stuber specifically said that they're planning on releasing a lot more audience numbers than they have in the past. This is something that has been long known that Netflix doesn't release a lot of their numbers. Tends to be that at the end of the quarter, when they're doing their financial reports, they tend to focus on a couple of the shows that have done significantly well. They tend to say Stranger Things had a ton of views within the first 30 days. We had this movie that came out, this original film that we had, this got a ton of views. They tend to do that, but they don't do that for a lot of the projects. And part of the reason they don't is because they don't want to necessarily reveal how successful things are, because they don't have to. They're not obligated to in any way. And while we've seen Amazon take a new approach by inviting Nielsen into their stats to reveal what actually is working on Amazon. Netflix said actually just a couple of weeks ago that they had no intention of doing something like that. However, Scott Stuber, person in charge of original films, he has gone on record to say that they're looking at revealing more numbers. Not necessarily all numbers per se, but they are looking at revealing more numbers for the sense of giving creative people the ability to see what is successful on their service, so that they could create projects and come to Netflix and say, hey, I've got this project. You did this other project. It was extremely successful. I've got a project that's kind of in the same vein, and it could do very well. And the idea is kind of opening up the ability to the creative community to understand what is successful and what's not successful on Netflix as a streaming service, which I think is a smart idea. And honestly, I think the transparency of revealing more numbers is a good thing for everybody. Netflix doesn't seem to be swayed by the fact that a show does or does not do very well. Obviously, they want to talk about shows that do very well, but if a show doesn't do very well, they're still not necessarily obligated to say it didn't do very well. And I guess in some ways you could surmise that if they don't talk about a show, it's probably because it didn't do very well, even if it does get renewed for a second season, or in some cases a sequel gets made. So it's one of those things where keep watching, because maybe Netflix is going to potentially be a little bit more transparent with what they reveal as far as the viewership of the shows that they have on the service.
I will believe it when I see those numbers, because for the longest time they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that. I think releasing the numbers is going to open up a can of worms that I'm not sure that Netflix wants to open, and I think that they've put it off as far as possible, because once you show the numbers for these shows, you're going to try to, you're going to do some analysis, and I can see a future where analysts from Wall Street are going to look at the shows from the numbers, and they're going to make some estimations on if something is successful or not successful, or does this film actually hurt or increase, either decreasing the churn count or increasing subscriber count. Like I can see a bunch of different things potentially in the future happening that Netflix for the longest time has just been putting off. I do agree with you that transparency is going to be better. I've heard a rumor, now I can't confirm it, but I heard a rumor that even like the creatives who like do these shows don't really know how successful it is, besides like checking Twitter, but we all know like Twitter's not that accurate on pretty much everything. Yeah, overall I think transparency is great. I'm just skeptical, and I'm curious about the future post transparency and how we're going to look at the success of like Netflix and HBO and Disney Plus, given like subscriber numbers and how all that looks.
It's definitely something we're going to have to keep an eye on. So the moving over into some quick discussions. The first one is award season has begun, and there's 2 different awards nominations that have been announced. And to be fair, streaming services are raking in the nominations. First up, we've got the Critics' Choice Awards, and as far as, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but Netflix raked up 61 nominations for its movies and TV shows, 14 of which were just for The Irishman. The other streaming services included Amazon Prime Video, they got 14, Hulu got 7, CBS All Access got 4, and even Apple got their first award nomination for The Morning Show. So that was the first one. Then this morning, while we're recording this on Monday, the nominations were revealed for the Golden Globes, and Netflix again got a ton of Golden Globe nominations as well. They actually received 17 nominations in the 11 film categories. As far as the TV entries, we had Netflix got 17 there, Amazon got 5, Hulu got 5, and then Apple TV Plus got 3. I gotta say, like, this is not super surprising in the sense of we know that these companies are shelling out an insane amount of money for content. So the idea that some of them would be, creating some content at least that would be garnering some award nominations is not necessarily a surprise in that sense. However, compared to just a year ago, that's where it gets interesting, because the one big difference is that when you got back in 2016, that was the first time Netflix actually got a nomination in the film category at the Golden Globes, and they only got 1. And here we are just 3 years later, and they've got 17. So everyone's talking about how much money Netflix is spending on content. Some of that money is being spent so that they get some awards recognition as well. And they're doing it because they're getting some big publicity when it comes to these awards. It's no longer just about the big Hollywood studios. It's also about the streaming services as well. Those numbers are only going to increase as time progresses.
I think that this article is a little bit clickbait in terms of the title, although if you kind of know how the nominations work just by paying attention to the last couple of years, you'll know that streaming services are pretty much raked a lot of these awards in. And even if it wasn't streaming services, it used to be like HBO and Showtime. They stole a lot of the nominations for great content over, other broadcast shows or other movies and stuff like that. So it's, in the premium TV market of like HBO, that spot has kind of evolved to Netflix and Hulu, and now they're pumping in a lot more content, a lot more money to high-end content. So it makes total sense why these streaming services are, kind of taking the lead. Also, they have the ability to have a lot of different shows. Like Netflix puts out a bunch of content. Some people might not like it, but for most of the time, they put out lots of good content. A lot of these streaming services produce, a decent amount of content. And so you have more opportunities to win some of these awards versus, different channels or, Showtime or Stars or something like that. Because they're just cranking out a bunch of stuff. So just for the numbers game, and then also the nature of the streaming services and how much money they put into it, it makes sense. Prediction for the future, I think that, streaming services are just going to kill the day at all these award shows. And that's where everything's moving to.
All right, so then our last conversation actually is a follow-up to a conversation we had last week, which took up the majority of the episode about sports on streaming services. Last week we were talking about how Amazon has streaming rights to Thursday Night Football in addition to the broadcast channels that are already also airing the Thursday Night Football, but Amazon has those rights. And we were talking about how maybe this is a sign of what could happen in the future. We've talked about how the popularity of sports in general and the amount of money that's tossed around for the rights for these different leagues that are out there can get to insane amounts of money. There was something that just happened actually last week. At the end of the week, Amazon actually launched their first coverage of a major league, with the Premier League, which is the English football coverage, soccer for those of you in the States who are unfamiliar with the European version of football. But they actually had a number of different games that you were able to stream immediately live on Amazon. And while the launch had a couple of different hiccups, there was and that was a lot of what the media was covering. However, the big news was that Amazon actually boasted that they had a massive amount of people subscribed to the service specifically so that they could watch the Premier League soccer. And they said that the number of people who are watching during their coverage of the games was in the millions. And generally speaking, the other broadcast channels that air these matches, they tend to get between 1 to 2 million viewers for specific games. So to have millions of viewers for just a few select games, not necessarily key games, it's really good numbers. And they also boasted that they had the most people sign up since 2007 at once, and that was a new record that they hit. So needless to say, sports in general are something that's going to be very popular, and this is just the very beginning.
Soccer in the United States isn't necessarily the biggest thing ever, but soccer has one of the biggest audiences in the world, and getting the Premier League on streaming service is a complete win for Amazon. And there are going to be people that will pay the Amazon Prime subscription just for streaming soccer matches. I mean, I know people, goodness sakes, I was at a church once and somebody in the pew was watching soccer and I was like, are you kidding me right now? Like, what is going on? Like, I just know people who will just show up anywhere and watch these games and go out of their way to watch these games. So I think just with the massive viewership, international viewership of, soccer, football, this is great for Amazon. And this is one of those sports, when we talked last week, this is one of those sports that if you get, the streaming rights to, just the audience is huge and crazy. And so This is just great. This is just great. And it's not a niche sport. It's not like, just one that is great for America. I mean, worldwide, everyone loves soccer.
And then just to piggyback off of that, one of the things that was also announced, we found this out via Cord Cutter News, but the Sports Business Journal newsletter actually reported that the NFL is closely watching to see how Amazon handles the Premier League streams. Specifically, they stated what Amazon's doing in the few weeks in the UK with their Premier League package will be very interesting to watch. And while they're not specifically saying something, they are not saying something, which is they are looking at Amazon as the potential, and seeing what their potential is for potential streaming rights for NFL games in the future. We know that, like we said, they have Thursday Night Football, and we know that a lot of these sports leagues are looking at the idea of what the streaming side of things could be. And we know the streaming services are looking for this live content that really brings people in and can make this services successful as just another component to their already large content library that a lot of them have. So there's that. Then there's also some word that Amazon will reportedly start streaming certain New York Yankees games next year for Major League Baseball, specifically the cable network, which is called Yes. The cable TV network for the Yankees will be streaming a limited amount of games on Amazon Prime Video this coming season, specifically as a plan to figure out whether or not it'd be viable as to see if they could create an annual subscription specifically for Yankees fans. It's an interesting time for sports, nonetheless. I'm personally not super into a lot of sports, but I can honestly say that the sports and what we see in the coming, I honestly feel like a lot of this stuff we're going to start seeing stuff happen and materialize in the next year. We're going to start seeing a lot of plays from these streaming services to get into the sports. Amazon is already primed because they already have a relationship with Thursday Night Football, and they're going to, and they've got now the Premier League for soccer, and it's like kind of like a point of concept to show people, hey, look what we can do. Meanwhile, there's other leagues that are going to either be starting up their own, not starting up, but expanding their own services that they already offer to get people, to get those people who are cord cutters, who are not using the broadcast channels, but because they need to figure out ways of keeping the revenue coming in to keep everything moving. So in order to do that, they can look towards these streaming services, and the streaming services in turn can look towards these leagues as a way to bolster the content that they can offer a subscriber. So it's going to be a win-win situation for them. And as a consumer, it's probably, you might run into a problem where you might have to subscribe to different services if you're looking for specific sports. But I mean, that's kind of what we're already running into with a lot of the content that's available on the variety of different services. But it's something that's going to happen. So stay tuned. All right. So with all of that being said, that is going to wrap up this episode of the Streaming Wars. I want to encourage everyone to head over to the site to check out the streaming calendar, the release calendar for all the content that is releasing. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter and join our Discord to check out all the articles that we are discussing here on the podcast, as well as other articles that may not make it into the podcast, but still worth checking out. Be sure to follow us on Instagram for all the latest notifications related to new episodes of the podcast. You can listen to this podcast on all podcast networks as well as over on YouTube. And if you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at thestreamingwars@gmail.com. And you can also leave us a review wherever you are listening to this podcast. That is always greatly appreciated. So for Tony and myself, this has been the Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.